Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Julia Minson. Welcome to the Harvard Kennedy School Seminar on Conflict Management and Depolarization. So this is a seminar that's organized by the Center for Public Leadership and the Management, Leadership, and Decision Science area of the Kennedy School. Today, I'm really excited to host Kristin Laurin. Kristin is a professor in the psychology department at the University of British Columbia. And she is going to be talking to us about perspective taking across partisan differences. One thing that I always like to mention, so it's always more fun when the talk is interactive and people ask questions and sort of just jump in. There's a couple ways you can do that. You can raise your actual physical hand and just kind of wave. You can raise your Zoom hand. You can put a question in the chat. Kristin is going to sort of take a pause here and there to ask if there are questions happening, but also I'm going to be keeping an eye on whether there are questions from the audience and pinging them to Kristin if she is too busy talking to notice the question. So just ask away, lots of questions. All right, Kristin, it's all yours.
All right, thank you so much, Julia. I'm probably not going to ask if anybody has any questions because I always think that's like the saddest thing ever when you ask, does anybody have any questions? And then no one does. It's like such a letdown. So I probably won't do that, but I will try to like pause and drink water and give you guys a chance to, to speak up, because I totally agree with Julia that a talk is much better when it's interactive and when it can be more of a conversation rather than me just like droning for 45 minutes. So I am super thrilled to be here. I'm bummed that I'm here in Vancouver and not with you all in person. Hopefully someone else pictured here at his undergraduate. She looks nothing like this anymore, but this is as close of a picture as he would let me show. So, all right, something we hear about a lot: politicians are polarized, right? So this isn't even the most recent data that we have. This is actually from 2014, and this is kind of, if you look at the voting record of US senators and US House representatives, you can see that there's like no overlap between the two parties, right? So the most conservative Democrat is still more liberal than the most liberal Republican. There's no areas of common ground there. It's also true, we know this from the data, but I think it's a little bit less intuitive, that regular people are kind of a little bit less polarized than our political elites. So this is data from the same year. And what you can see just on sort of the citizen voters, and you can see that with voters, there is some overlap. So there are some Democrats and some Republicans who have some of the same ideas, right? There's room for some common ground between the two parties. But I said we don't hear about this as much. And, I'm not just saying that, like there's a lot of research to suggest that we don't recognize this overlap between members of different parties. So this isn't my work. This is work by Lewandowski and Malhotra, where they got a sample of Democrats and Republicans, and they asked them 3 questions. So what do you believe? What does the typical Democrat believe? And what does the typical Republican believe? And they did this across lots of different issues, lots of different samples, and they always find the same thing. So these are what their graphs look like. What we're seeing here is the dark black bars represent like the actual difference between their Republican and Democratic participants. Okay, so you can see that Republicans and Democrats like think different things. That makes sense. But then the thin black bars, those are the perceived differences between Republicans and Democrats. So those thin bars are always, like without exception, bigger than the thick black bars, right? This misperception is in the same direction. We think that our parties are further apart than they are. We don't recognize the overlap between them. And I think one of the reasons we don't recognize this overlap is that we don't really want to talk to each other. We don't really want to listen to what the other side has to say. So this is just kind of anecdotal. So a few years ago, Pew did this qualitative interview research, this poll with voters who had voted either for Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. And the question that they asked these voters was just like, what do you want the other side to know about you? And they got a lot of answers that looked like this. So, this is a Trump voter saying sort of, I would like the other side to know that they should listen to people like me and recognize that they have an incorrect view of what we're like, right? Recognize that they're really narrow-minded in terms of how they think about us. And, if they tried to understand us, maybe we would actually, they would actually see things differently. But they also got a lot of responses like this one. So this is the response of a Hillary Clinton voter who says, what I would like the other side to know is that they've been brainwashed and that I simply have no regard for them. Right? So we want people to listen to us because we recognize that they don't have a correct view of our side, but we don't really flip that around on ourselves. We don't think like, oh, well, maybe I'm misunderstanding the other side too. And you don't just have to believe my obviously cherry-picked Pew research survey examples. There's also lots of research on this. So this is some research that was done shortly after the Obama-Romney election. And what these researchers did was they asked, we're going to see Obama voters on the left of the graph, Romney voters on the right of the graph. And the question is, how interested are you in hearing about other Obama voters, other Romney voters, about their reasons for why they voted the way they did? And helpfully, they've benchmarked their graph here so that we can see how much people are interested in things like going for a walk on a sunny day, and also how much they're interested in something like having their tooth pulled. So if we look first at how people feel about even having conversations with their own side, so Obama voters hearing from other Obama voters, Romney voters hearing from other Romney voters, we're not like that stoked on it, right? Don't talk to me about politics. I'm pretty neutral on having a conversation, even with someone who's on my own side. And then when you ask me how much I want to have a conversation about someone from the other side, that just like totally falls off a cliff, right? It's like almost literally like pulling teeth to try to get someone to listen to somebody whose political opinion is different from theirs. So basically, if you're a Democrat, okay, let's just imagine you're a Democrat, along comes a Republican, you're both likely to just kind of turn away and choose not to engage with each other in the very kinds of conversations that could remind you that after all, you're both mammals, you have a lot of the same interests, you're not actually necessarily that different. And so this is, a lot has been written about how this is a problem. And it is a problem, but I want to highlight that if this is the rule, right, people not listening to each other, people not having conversations across party lines, there are exceptions to this rule. So here's a final, I promise this is the last qualitative interview quote I'm going to show you. This is somebody who said, this is a much rarer type of response in the qualitative Pew poll, but this is a different Clinton voter who says, I would like the other side to understand that I'm actually willing to have a conversation with them. And as long as we're both kind of approaching this with some good faith, and, I think we can find a better path forward for all of us. And so what I want to pose as my first research question is, if you come across somebody like this, so if you come across one of these exceptional people who's on your side, but willing to go ahead and talk to the other side and find out what they're all about, how are you going to feel about that? How do we think about allies who seek political opponents' views? And I'm going to just pause for some water here just in case I need to.
Kristin, can I jump in with one question? And I'm sure this is going to be sort of obvious once you get into the studies and the methods, but I am curious about if you have any intuition, or if from the Pew data, right? Why do we have this sense that people might be judged negatively for engaging with opponents' views, right? Because I certainly hear that question often from students, like, oh, well, won't this like blow back on me if I'm a little bit too friendly with the other side? And I'm curious if you have, if your research will answer this question, or if you just sort of have some intuitions about why are we even like afraid of this?
Yeah, well, yes, by the end of the talk, I think you'll see one possible answer, but I'll give you a preview. I think it's Twitter. I think I think the problem is Twitter. Such an easy scapegoat, right? But that's it's going to take us a while to get there, but we will get there. And I should say too, I don't know totally what the norms are in terms of your talks. I'm not going to go super heavy on methods. Like I'll try to give you a sense of what our methods were, but if at any point you think I'm being too hand wavy or not giving enough detail, like please feel free to stop me and ask me, and I'll try to get more specific or answer whatever your question is. Yeah, just in case you're interested.
Okay, fabulous. That helps. And also, speaking of talk norms, I feel like this is the least turned on cameras I have ever seen in a talk. So as delightful as it is to watch the two of us on screen together, I would love to see some more faces so we can just like pretend we're having a community moment for a second here. So I think if anybody's feeling brave and wants to turn on their camera, hi Hannah, thank you. Now we can be the three of us. Hello people, thank you. There's humans there. Okay, Kristin, go on. But it's nice to see some human faces.
I agree. Unfortunately, there's only so many at a time I can see, but I'll try to just kind of randomly scroll to catch more people. So, okay, what do we think of allies who seek political opponents' views? On the one hand, we might dislike them, right? So a lot of people think that their opponents' views, their political opponents' views, are categorically wrong, morally repulsive. And so when someone on your side says that they want to understand those shared opponents, like that's sort of implying that there's some legitimacy to those views, right? That there's something that they could learn by engaging with those views. They're implying that they might have some credibility, and that might be kind of disturbing to you. Okay, we also might worry that our allies who seek shared opponents' views will be convinced to jump ship, right? They'll be convinced to change their minds and join our opponents on their side. And again, that's going to be kind of disturbing if I think that my opponents are sort of categorically wrong and morally repulsive. So there's some evidence on this side of the equation too, right? We don't like it when our leaders compromise with shared opponents. So leaders on my side compromising with leaders on the other side. I don't like that. Right? And we don't like it when people empathize with other people who hold views that we find illegitimate, right? So to the extent that I think my political opponents have illegitimate views, somebody from my side going to talk to them, that's maybe getting a little bit close to empathizing with them, and that's not something that people like. But if you look at this guy, like I'm just showing you the quote I showed you before, he doesn't seem like a bad guy, right? He actually seems pretty nice. He seems tolerant. He seems cooperative. He's rationally seeking information to like make himself more informed. Like these are things that we generally approve of. And so maybe we actually like it when our allies seek shared opponents' perspectives for these very reasons. And I see a hand up, and so I would love to take the question, Charlie.
Yeah, I figured I'd just throw the virtual hand so you could stop when you wanted to. A question on what you mean by perspective takers. So are we talking, like, you've used a couple different words, maybe it's all of them. Is it seek information? Is it listen to? Is it be friends with? Is it compromise position on? Is it all of these things? So I'm curious about how you're thinking about, like, what behavior exactly are we talking about here?
Yeah.
And we expect different things for different types of behavior here.
Great question. So we have operationalized this as trying to understand their perspectives by directly engaging with them. So in some of our studies, that means reading what they've written. In other studies, that means kind of or watching, news that's known to be ideologically leaning one way or the other. In other studies, it's actually going out and approaching people who hold those views and engaging them in conversation. So that level, we haven't, like, perspective seeking to me is different than like actually compromising. Like that maybe is a potential consequence of seeking another person's perspective. And you'll see in one of the studies I'm going to talk about, we've manipulated kind of people's motivations for doing this, or targets' motivations for doing this. Like, are you trying to like get intelligence so that we can beat them? Or are you trying to sort of genuinely understand and potentially actually compromise? So we've tried to do this in a bunch of different ways, but it's always, like engaging with either the people or their knowledge products to try to understand where they're coming from. Cool. So Yeah, it seems like that's something we could like in some, to the extent that we see it as tolerant, cooperative, and rational. And there's this other body of literature that suggests that we do like it when people do things that are at least similar to this, right? So we like it as much as we don't like it when our leaders compromise with the other side. We do like it when they're civil, right? And perspective seeking could be kind of civil. We also like it when people respect their political opponents. Trying to understand them seems like it's respectful too. And I mean, it certainly seems like it's beneficial. So I know Julia and many of her collaborators have studied receptiveness, which I think is very tied to this perspective seeking idea, and shown that it has benefits for groups. And so there's good reasons why we might actually like this. So this was our first, we were left with these kind of two possibilities in terms of answering these first questions. You might like an ally who seeks a shared opponent's views, or you might dislike that ally. And so last year we published a paper that tried to disentangle between, or that put forth these two hypotheses and tried to see, you know, which one we found most support for. And all of the studies, so this is the part where I'm going to be especially light on methods, but I'm going to just generally kind of characterize what our studies are like, and then we'll get into some of the more specifics as we go. But generally our studies look something like this. So we find out something about you, we find out what you believe. Okay, and then we introduce you to someone who's an ally, who has the same beliefs as you. And then we manipulate whether that ally is a perspective seeker, so someone who seeks to engage with shared opponents and understand their beliefs, or an avoider, so someone who decides, like, who for different reasons says, you know, I prefer not to engage with the other side. And then we measure your attitudes toward this ally. And most often we do it using a combination of these three measures. So one, we have a feeling thermometer. So on a scale of like 0 to 100, how warm versus cold do you feel towards this person? We have some emotion words that we have you rate in terms of how you feel towards this person, you know, angry, respectful, so on, things like that, sort of like ranging from negative to positive. And then we have a measure of social proximity. So how much do you want to be close to this person versus distant? And then we kind of standardize them and put them all together to form a composite of just your attitude towards this person. And not to like spoil the punchline too much for this study, but the big picture, or for this paper, but the big picture is that we have a whole bunch of studies, and across all of these studies, this is all of the data that we have, or that we had at the time that we published this paper. Across all the studies, we find a really consistent and like reasonably large effect, such that people prefer seekers over avoiders. We prefer allies who go and talk to our opponents, even though this isn't something we like to do ourselves, but we prefer allies who go and talk to their opponents compared to allies who, you know, would prefer to turn the other way. And I'll just add that all the studies that are in this package, as well as all the ones I'm going to talk about today, with one exception, are pre-registered on the Open Science Framework, and all the analyses that I'm telling you about are ones that we've committed to a priori. Julia, yes.
So, I mean, first of all, these effects are huge. They're not like moderate, they're really big.
I know.
And one of the things it makes me think about, so I can sort of picture what the manipulation would be like, as far as, you know, I want to go and read this person's thing because I want to understand where they're coming from. I'm curious what the control conditions look like, because, you know, like in doing some related research myself, like there's a lot of ambiguity in how you avoid somebody's views, right? It's like, it could be that you just sort of like change the subject, or it could be like, no, I don't want to hear your horrible, like immoral things, and so I'm going to never speak to you again.
Yeah. So this is also something where we've tried to do it a few different ways, because, like, full disclosure, when we got the first studies results back, and I think I mentioned this to some of you in my meetings this morning, like I told the grad student he must have miscoded the conditions. I was like, there's no chance that people are saying this and that this is what people mean. And it took me kind of a long time to get on board with what was going on. So over the course of trying to get me on board with it, we tried like a lot of different operationalizations of both of these sides of things. So you'll see a couple of examples in a minute, but I'll add too that we've sometimes had just a pure control condition where you just find out that someone's an ally, but you don't find out anything else. about their behavior. And typically we find that that control condition is kind of right in the middle between the avoiders and the seekers. So there seems to be an active ingredient on both sides of the equation. But yeah, I think to kind of your point more specifically, we have some cases where the avoider is kind of, it's like more active avoidance. It's like, I'm just like saying, I don't want to hear about this. And then we have other studies where it's more like you infer it from their behavior, just the fact that they're not doing it. And I'll show you an example of that. I think it's going to come up maybe in 3 or 4 slides. So hopefully we'll get there. I should also mention that I can see many of you in the video, but I can't see everyone. And I don't know if there's a way I can reorganize my screen such that I can see everyone. Maybe, oh yeah, there is. So, okay, so now if you put your hand up, I probably will see you. But before it was just a few people who I would have been able to see. Okay, so all right, but so having all of this data in hand, now I've lost my cursor to advance, there it is. Having all of this data in hand, so this was kind of our first set of findings, right? What do we think of allies who seek political opponents' views? Well, we like them. But if you're anything like me, like given what I just said, maybe you're not totally convinced yet. Maybe you need a few more details. I certainly did, like I said, when we got the first and second and third studies back. So I want to spend a little bit of time unpacking like all of the different ways in which this generalizes before I even get further than just this main effect. So first of all, it happens regardless of whether we manipulate the allies' behavior within subjects or between subjects. So we have some studies one way, some studies the other way, doesn't make a difference. Second, it happens, and this is maybe going to address Julia's question a little bit, it happens regardless of whether we operationalize like ideological differences in terms of broad ideologies like conservative versus liberal, or on specific issues. So coming first to broad ideologies. So one example of a study is if you would come into the study, okay, let's say you're a Republican. We introduce you to a fellow Republican, and we manipulate the way that we manipulate whether that Republican is a seeker or an avoider is in one condition, we show you this person's news watching habits. So when it's a seeker target, an ally who seeks opposing views, you get to see that they spend 2 hours a week watching news sources known to be liberal. You can imagine maybe MSNBC fitting in this category. Instead, if you learn that the person in the condition where you're learning that the ally is an avoider, you just learn that this person doesn't really watch liberal news sources like MSNBC, which is, I think, the kind of more passive type of avoidance that I was referencing before. Okay, so we see the effect if we do this. We also see the effect in terms of specific issues. So in a study like this, we would ask you about a few of your positions on these different issues. So let's say you tell us that you're pro-gun rights. We would introduce you to someone who's also pro-gun rights and either seeking or avoiding the views of others who are on the other side of that debate, so pro-gun control, and we find the same effect. There was a time where I thought that the participants were just lying. So I said, let's bring them into the lab and watch their behavior, and we're going to catch them. Like, they can't be this positively disposed towards open-minded people. And so we ran this whole study. We had people coming to the lab in groups, and then we threw a couple of Confederates in the group, and they introduced themselves, and the Confederates turn out to be, of course, political allies of the participant, but disagreeing in terms of whether it makes more sense to reach out and talk to opponents or just to kind of ignore them and move ahead without them. And then participants, we get them to kind of pair off, and the participant gets to choose who they want to work with. And like 3/4 of the time, so this is like a huge effect, they're choosing to work with the Confederate who was the seeker. And by the way, we obviously counterbalanced which research assistant was playing which role. It wouldn't have made as much sense if we'd had, the same Confederate in each role every time, because then maybe it's something else about the Confederate. But no, regardless of which Confederate is playing the seeker, that's the one that participants want to spend time with. This also happens regardless, like I said before, of the seeker's goal for what their stated intention is with trying to understand shared opponents. And this is one I was sure would actually make a difference. So in this study, this was a between subject study where we had one seeker who was, their goal was to gather intelligence, like I was saying before. I see there's a question in the chat I'm going to get to in a second. So I want to like find out what they think so I can develop better counter arguments to what they think. And we had another seeker who said that they wanted to just genuinely understand where the other side was coming from. And even if that means potentially compromising, which was a thing, I thought people would really hate that, but it turned out like, if anything, they liked it a little bit more. So Stanley, in the previous study, the question is whether the Confederates were playing actors just to see how subjects behaved. So yeah, we basically wanted to see which of the actors the participant would want to spend time with, the one who was acting the role of seeker or the one who was acting the role of avoider. So I guess you would say, you know, maybe there are other things that we assume about seekers and avoiders that we weren't confounding with that in this manipulation. Allison, what exactly does compromising entail? So in this study, I think the exact wording, I don't know that we said anything beyond compromising. I can't be sure. If we did, it would have said something about like finding common ground kind of in between our two positions. So to me, what that means is like giving up a little bit so that we can agree, so we can kind of get to a place where we agree. Again, the person hasn't done it yet. Like, I think if the person actually like had the ability to materially, you know, give up some of what your group wants and did it, then we might not like that as much, but I can't say for sure. This is, you know, we're sort of just at that stage. Participants, so in some of the studies, sorry, I'm like leaning over to look at the chat over there. Some studies, the participants are undergraduate students. Sometimes they're research, like internet research participants. We have some sort of politically representative samples as well. And then sort of as promised, I'm going to talk a little bit about Twitter and some Twitter data by the end. You didn't, thank you for being so polite, Kim. You didn't miss anything. As I said, I may have gone like too light on some of the methodological details. So I'm glad that you guys are putting the questions for the things that you want to know in there. This particular study is not undergraduate students. The one before, however, it was. So in this motivation study, just kind of, we were interested in the different motivations for the seekers, but we also, just for the sake of completeness, manipulated why the person is avoiding shared perspective. So again, this is maybe back to the question from before about like, there are lots of different ways of doing this. And so we actually had one of the avoiders who said, basically, they don't want to talk to the other side because they're just super committed to your side and they don't, you know, they want to stay loyal and they don't need to hear the arguments that the other side is making. And we had another person who was avoiding the other side because they just didn't want it. They knew it would rile them up and they knew they would get into a fight and they would just get upset. And what's interesting is that that's actually the reason that people most often give for why they themselves don't seek other opposing views. They don't want to get riled up. They don't want to get upset. So this is a really common, you can see my cursor, I think, right? This is a really common behavior that we see, but it's like the thing that participants liked the least. So I thought that's kind of interesting. In this study, we also have a baseline condition. So this is a condition where we just have someone who's, you know they're on your side, but they don't say anything further about engaging with opponents or not engaging with opponents. And you can see that participants feel kind of in the middle about them. So they like both of the seekers more than this baseline ally, and they dislike both of the avoiders more than this baseline ally. Yes, Juliana.
Hi, this is really interesting. I guess I don't know if people would self-report that they prefer to avoid the other side's opinion, but they certainly behave, and they will avoid the other side's opinion. And so I guess I'm wondering if like you've ever done anything to kind of put together those research findings that, is it like the same people who would say I want to avoid are the ones who would still like the person who seeks, the one who doesn't avoid?
That's a great question.
Have you ever done that, or have you ever like thought about that?
No, we haven't. So we haven't compared like what participants say they like to what participants themselves actually do in the same study. I think we've talked about this though, and we've wondered sort of who participants sort of think is more like them, even though again, like based on the research, we would say they're most like this person, but is that how participants self-perceive? I'm not sure. I'm sure that in one of these studies or several, we've measured similarity, and I could go back and take a look at that and see, is above and beyond kind of this main effect, is there a moderating role for how similar you think you are, right? Like for people who kind of identify as more similar to these people, do they like them more? Or even the people who recognize that this is what they do, are they kind of like everyone else and prefer people who are open-minded? That's a great question.
Thank you.
Charlie, I saw your hand up too.
Yeah, I love that question, Juliana. One fun way you could potentially test that is in one of the studies you showed the breakdown of the news people pick.
Mm-hmm.
And you could just ask participants, what would you like to see in this study? And then you could compare their choices to the seekers and avoiders and look at how that relates to their evaluations of these different people.
Yeah, or like, tell me honestly, Democrat, like how much Fox News do you watch, right? Like, tell me what you do, and then we can see, like, does what, are people,
But you don't even need to rely on their reports, because you could like have them make the decisions in the study.
Yeah, like I'm going to show you a news clip now. Who do you want it to be, right? Rachel Maddow or Tucker Carlson? Yeah, that'd be super interesting. I like that. So, okay, by this point, I at least was convinced that at least there was kind of something meaningful about this repeated pattern that we kept getting. Maybe we do like allies who seek shared opponents' views. But I still was kind of curious, like, why would this be? And like, what about our initial intuitions about these things that we might dislike about seekers, right? Like, I get why we would potentially like them. They seem like, they embody these traits that we like: tolerance, cooperation, rationality. But what about this other side? Like, are we not worried, right? Like, I'm worried sometimes about my friends, like if they seem like they're giving credibility to views that I really find abhorrent, or like if they go spend too much time over there, like, are they going to get convinced that this is, something that they should believe too? And so we did, our first approach to this was basically just like, standard mediation. If we measure all of these perceptions, does that account for any of the relationship? And can we see, whether people have any of these intuitions about seekers the way we thought that they would? And so across 3 different samples, for some reason I didn't put the sample size on this slide, but 3 different samples we found. So on the one hand, people do see seekers in all of these ways. So they do see them as tolerant, cooperative, and rational. And they do, though, flag concerns about potentially legitimizing and validating abhorrent views and potentially, maybe adopting them. And those effect sizes are pretty similar, right? Like, I'm perceiving these to equal degrees. But then in terms of what predicts people's attitudes or their liking, it's both, but it's just much more these kind of broad traits, right? My ultimate answers to who I like and who I want to spend time with are driven much more by my perceptions of these kind of 3 positively valence traits that we ascribe to prospective seekers, compared to these kind of more politics specific kinds of things. And so that was kind of interesting to me. It was reassuring that I wasn't totally crazy, like that these effects were actually there. But I guess, okay, like not everybody cares that much about politics, like enough to like have that really drive their liking to as much of a degree as the broader kind of traits.
Kristin?
Yep.
Can I try to ask a really broad question? So I'm trying to reconcile this in my head with selective exposure research. And I have a story that I made up that made a lot of sense to me, but one of your studies is not consistent with my made up story. And so I'm hoping you could help me.
Sure.
So, one of the explanations for selective exposure, right, is that our peers sort of will punish us for consuming opposing views, right? And, Dan Kahan does a lot of this stuff. And I have like a set of studies where that's also the case. And so the story that I made up to reconcile these things is that, like, well, when we're considering a person who is consuming opposing views or not consuming opposing views, we're not sort of thinking about the counterfactual of like, well, if they're not consuming opposing views, they're consuming my side views, right? So maybe like the selective exposure work is all predicated on this thing of choosing one side or the other. And I definitely prefer people who choose my side rather than the other side. Whereas if I'm just thinking about a person who is either becoming more informed or not becoming more informed, then becoming more informed is better. And so that was all great for about 5 minutes. And then I remembered about the study that was just brought up in the conversation about how many hours of what you watch. And that now doesn't fit. But I'm trying to figure out how to reconcile all this stuff together.
Yeah, because in that study, you're seeing that they're watching, primarily their own news coverage, which made sense. Like we kind of had, it wasn't credible if we said somebody was a conservative, but they only ever watch MSNBC, right?
Right.
Can you remind me? Sorry, I'm not sure if I heard properly. In your studies, is it that people are worried about being punished for consuming opposing views, or that they are punished for consuming opposing views?
They are punished for consuming opposing views, and the way we do it is that we have people make choices about whose advice to consume. And when they consume more like opposing advice in a decision-making task, their own side punishes them.
Yeah, I wonder whether, so like some of this space is quite confusing. I mean, I sort of alluded to there being literature on both sides, but like that's only proliferating more and more. I feel like there are more and more studies that show kind of in line with this, like we really like open-mindedness, but simultaneously more and more studies that show the opposite. And so this is going to sound really nitpicky, but I wonder whether like our device is the operative word there. So if I'm looking for you for advice, like I want you to tell me what to do, to me, that's going to raise these alarm bells a lot more, right? Like I'm not just trying to figure out why you believe what you believe. I want you to tell me basically what I should believe or what I should do. And so I wonder if that's kind of the difference, because I think, and I'm going to show a couple of studies in a minute, that we can moderate this. We can make this stuff stronger. In these studies, we never managed to kind of flip it all the way to the other side, but maybe that was just our lack of imagination as far as like how salient we could make these concerns. But that would be my, armchair guess about what's going on with that.
Yeah, I wonder, right? I wonder if sort of a slightly broader version of that idea is that if we're talking about something that has a right answer, people are suddenly much more like judgmental about people seeking right answers from the other side. Whereas if we're talking about sort of like broadly, like learning and understanding the world, then I'm okay with you having more things in your head.
Yeah, maybe it could be something like that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so I want to say a little bit more about why, by digging a little bit into this question that I was just addressing, like, is it really going to be always the case that we prefer our allies to seek opponents' views? Like, are there not things that we could do that would bring out that negative pathway a little bit more strongly, right? That would make people, raise people's concerns about some of these negative perceptions or subjectively negative perceptions. And so just going back to these ideas about what these perceptions are, if we start with the first one, if it's true that we're going to dislike perspective seekers to the extent that they might be convinced to join the allies, one possibility is that, right, this concern is going to be more and more salient to the extent that people are less and less committed to our side in advance. So in all of our studies, like I've said, we've been studying allies, right? Like, how do I think about someone who I know is on my side going to do this? But if we weaken that commitment to my side, right, surely then we should see the effect diminish. And so that's what we did in one study. So we had, imagine that you're a Democrat in our study, okay? And in one condition, we just do our regular study. So this is, you're seeing an ally who's fully committed to your side. He's a Democrat just like you. They either seek or avoid opponents' views, and you much prefer the ally who seeks opponents' views to the one who avoids them. We have a second condition where we're calling this the partially committed condition. So this is an undecided person, but they're saying they're going to check out your side. So they tell you that they're going to go listen to what your side has to say, and then they're either seeking or avoiding what opponents have to say. And even in this case, so the effect is a little bit stronger, but we still prefer someone who's undecided to go and see the opponents as opposed to avoid the opponents, as long as they're going to go and see our side too. And then we have a third condition, the totally uncommitted condition, where this time the person is an undecided voter who's also not really mentioning anything about your side. And so this is sort of neither of these cases, Julia, is the case that you were thinking about, where like the seeking the other side and avoiding the other side is going to be, confounded with avoiding my side and seeking my side. So we don't have that comparison. But in this case, we finally get the effect to disappear, right? Somebody who's uncommitted, who's not even talking about going to, try to understand my side, then we at least, I'm shocked, frankly, that this orange bar isn't lower than the purple bar, that we wouldn't dislike someone who's trying to understand only the opponent's views, as opposed to someone who's just kind of like apathetic about everything. But at least we kind of eliminate the effect there. Okay, the last study from this paper that I'm going to talk about is the one that kind of looks at this this other potentially negative view that we could have of people who seek opponents' perspectives. And that's, okay, so to the extent that we think that, to the extent that we might worry that perspective seekers are granting legitimacy to our opponents' views, we should be especially, the effect should be smaller. We should prefer seekers less, or maybe even not at all, if the opponents that they're trying to engage with are especially extremist opponents, right? So if people who not only disagree with me, but are like super far on the other side of disagreeing with me, they're the ones who have views that I'm going to find most illegitimate. And so if you're seeking those views, then I'm going to maybe be especially concerned that you're, why do you think that they have anything good to say? So again, last study. So this is another, again, we replicate the basic effect in our main condition, in our sort of typical condition. And this is a condition where, so we do this across a bunch of different issues, but let's say that you're assigned to the gun condition, okay? And let's say that you support gun control. You're now rating a target who either seeks or avoids shared opponents who just support gun rights, okay? So this is our typical effect. You'd rather that someone who's like you and supports gun control goes out and talks to people as opposed to avoids people who are on the other side. Then we have another condition where the seeker or avoider is with respect to people who have really extreme views. So not just people who support gun rights, they're not just seeking or avoiding the views of people who support gun rights, they're seeking or avoiding the views of people who support extreme gun rights policies, like removing all existing background checks and just like handguns for everyone. And again, like I was very, very surprised that the effect is still there. So I forgot to put the stars for significance, but this is still a significant difference. It's much smaller, which like, at least I'm not totally crazy, but somehow like it's still there, this preference for people going out and talking to opponents, even when those opponents hold the views that you're likely to find the most illegitimate. And so by the end of this paper, like I have to say, I was pretty confused. So I became convinced that we were like finding something meaningful, right? People by and large prefer allies who seek the views of shared opponents. But I don't know, I just found this so surprising. And I'll tell you a bit of a personal story. So in 2017, I actually bought this book. So in case, I'm personally in my personal life, pretty liberal person. But I went out and bought this book because I thought, Megyn Kelly, we disagree about everything, I think, but she seems smart. And like, maybe if I buy this book, I will understand better, why she thinks the way she does and why so many people agree with her. But I didn't tell anyone that I did that. And I've talked about this research a little bit before, but I've never this is the first time I'm telling this personal story to an actual audience, because I cannot shake this feeling that, my liberal friends are going to look at me sideways or worse if they find out that I did this. And so, a little heart. And so the next question I wanted to ask is basically am I just like a uniquely bad judge of human nature that I have this intuition, or is that more common? Like, do people have this idea that people underestimate liking for seekers? Yes, I am worried, Stanley, like on some level, even though I published a paper that says the opposite, I'm worried that like people will stigmatize me, people who I am allies with will stigmatize me for having bought this book. And I feel like Megyn Kelly is like a less relevant figure now than she was in 2017. So I'm not even sure like what people think of her anymore. But at the time, she was kind of like viewed as the sort of rational spokesperson, or like, most publicly appealing, I think, spokesperson for the Republican Party. And yeah, we could talk more about the book in the question and answer if we wanted to. Yes, Hannah.
Forgive me if I missed this, but where I run into this is more when people feel like an ideological opponent would kind of like denies their identity, you know? So if it's, you know, whether that's racism or intolerance with regard to sexual preference or some other thing where the person really feels like, you know, this, and that's the boundary that I, anyways, that I've experienced. If you looked at all about whether it's just like, so guns is not, I mean, actually guns on the other side might be threatening to the extent to which it could be a cultural issue for some people, and people saying you should ban guns is sort of denying those people who've kind of grown up in a gun culture's identity. But anyways, I was just wondering whether you thought about that policy disagreement versus identity.
That is a really good distinction. So we, you know, throughout the course of the research, like tried to make it sort of as hot button or as like morally loaded topics as we could. I remember that there was a study that we did. I remember talking about this idea. I don't remember whether it went anywhere, but we talked about like Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter kind of conflict. And like, if you're kind of saying you're on one side, but you're going to consult with the other side, I think that's a good intuition. Like, it's hard for me to imagine that at least if we had the right sample of people whose identities are most relevant. So Black people, you know, if I had a Black friend and I said, listen, I'm with you on Black Lives Matter, but like, I'm just going to go talk to the other side to try to understand why they don't think that's a good thing that you should be saying. It's hard for me to imagine that this would happen. Yeah. So maybe you're right there about identity. We hadn't thought about it in those terms, but yeah, that's a really good idea. Thanks, Hannah.
Really neat stuff. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna speed a little bit through the next part because I want to get to the Twitter stuff that I promised you. So in just a couple studies that I'll show you, we basically, so if Gordon was showing you this, it would be a video, because what we showed participants was a video. I'm not that tech savvy, so you're going to have to bear with me, but like the participants saw this whole text message conversation unfolding live. Like they saw the like 3 little dots showing up, and they heard like the click, click, click of people who don't know how to turn off that click, click, click function on their phones and everything. Anyway, so in the conversation, this is a conversation between 2 people who reveal themselves to be allies and also allies of the participants. So this would be a video, a still from a video that a participant who said that they were pro-life saw. So they established that they're allies. And then in one condition, this red ally goes on to talk about being a perspective seeker. So they're saying that they want to understand the people on the other side, on the pro-choice side, and they spent the morning reading articles that those people had written. Okay, this person is a seeker. In the other condition, the red texter goes on to reveal themselves as an avoider. So like, I already understand the views of pro-choice people and I don't agree with them. So I spent the morning kind of scrolling past their articles when I was trying to read stuff. This person's an avoider. And in both cases, the videos end with this like total cliffhanger where the red texter says like, anyways, do you want to hang out this weekend? And then you see ... and then the video cuts off. And so then what we do is, as a participant, you're supposed to say, you know, what do you think the chances are that the blue texter said, yeah, let's hang out. So first, in one condition, just to make sure that this paradigm is similar to our other paradigms, we say, imagine that you're the blue texter. So what would you do? And here we replicate the familiar effect, right? People say that there's a higher chance that they would hang out with the person who said that they were a seeker and a lesser chance that they would hang out with the person who said that they were an avoider. But then in another condition, in the sort of key condition for this study, where we want to say, but what do you think other people like you would do? So another person who's also pro-choice, what would they do? Well, now we don't think there's any difference. So we think that other people, I think I'm the only one who likes perspective seekers. Other people like perspective seekers less, and actually they like perspective avoiders a lot more. We replicated this in a design where we included a baseline condition. So a condition where it's about it's a different text. They're like book club members or something like that. And they're talking about what books they're going to read next. And we include a condition where they establish themselves as allies, but again, they don't mention one way or the other what they do. Okay, and again, we get this interaction when you're saying what you would do, your least favorite person is the avoider, the person who says, I don't want to read the book written by the other side. But when it comes to predicting what other people think, you think their least favorite person is going to be the seeker, the person who says, actually, I'd kind of like to read this book of what what the other side has written. And so again, this is just a couple studies. We're still working on this paradigm. We're trying to do like a behavioral thing now, and maybe potentially something else that we have in the works. But it seems as if people might underestimate, or people might not anticipate, the effect that we've found so robustly in our studies, which is that people like allies who seek opposing views. And so the sort of the question that kind of comes to me about this is, why is that the case? Why is it that if people do like perspective seekers, why do we have this misperception? Why do we have this intuition? Why am I so scared to tell people about this Megyn Kelly book? What's happening? And of course, as I said, like, not an original thought really, but like, maybe it's Twitter's fault. That was kind of our first thought, is like, maybe, what people see on Twitter, maybe that's a little bit different, and maybe like, let's just see what happens there. To be honest, that's not where we started, just wanting to see what would happen on Twitter without having this intuition about it explaining these misperceptions. But so I'm a little bit misleading you here as a segue into this part of the talk. But the point is, we turned to Twitter. And we started out, I think, in a bit of maybe an unusual place on Twitter, but we started out with basically all of the tweets that the then current US senators had ever sent. So this was a little bit before 2020, so not the current slate of US senators, but we started with all of their tweets. And we started with senators because it was a manageable number of people. There were like 100 of them only. We also knew which side of the aisle they were on. And so it would be easy for us to see from their tweets, if they're talking about trying to listen to someone or talk to someone, we could easily identify, are they talking about an opponent? So is that relevant to what we're doing or not? So we started out, like I said, with all the tweets that they'd ever sent. So there were about 300,000 tweets. And we sort of filtered those down to tweets that could potentially, we thought, be relevant to perspective seeking or avoiding. So we filtered them for keywords like listen or ignore, or words that sort of in our first sort of perusal of these tweets suggested might be relevant. That left us with about 26,000 tweets. And we played around a little bit with machine learning for this, but it turns out it's sort of nuanced, like figuring out exactly what should count as what. It didn't really work out with the machine learning way. We looked at, so these were not campaign Twitter accounts, just like the purported personal accounts of the senators, but they were usually called like Senator somebody or other. So we tackled the problem of having these 26,000 tweets by basically just like this was our very first pass at doing this. We just took a subsample, or we use a random number generator to get 5,000 of those tweets. And we thought, okay, well, we can search through these tweets, find the ones where the senators are saying like, let's talk to each other on the other side of the aisle, find the tweets where the senators are saying, let's not do that. Like, I don't want to hear from my opponents about this, or the tweets that are irrelevant. And see, like, what do the followers think, right? We know from other research that followers tend to be ideologically aligned. And so, right, what do my allies think when I, as a senator, either advocate seeking or avoiding other sides' views? And the first thing that I'll show you is that when we went through these 5,000 tweets with trying to identify perspective seeking as we had sort of operationalized it, what we found was zero. So there were like no tweets by US senators where they were like genuinely advocating or genuinely just talking about, listening to the other side and trying to understand them. So I think this is like, actually, we're going to get past this, but I think this is kind of an important piece of the thing, right? Like, this is not something, at least, that senators publicly on Twitter do, right? And I think on its own, that's kind of instructive. Like, if people who we see as our leaders are not doing a certain behavior, maybe that's sort of a signal to us about the value of that behavior. But we didn't want to kind of be stuck with this finding. And so we sort of expanded our definition a little bit of what perspective seeking could mean. And we managed to find in this set of tweets a few, like enough, like a small percentage, but enough that counted as what we defined here as seeking. I want to just be clear, though, this was like not necessarily like ideal examples from our perspective. So for example, here we have Heidi Heitkamp saying that it's important to hear from all perspectives, which like you could sort of read into that and understand like, oh, maybe she means also perspectives from ideological opponents, but it's not necessarily that clear, right? Or else we have Pat Toomey here talking about a town hall and hearing from all Pennsylvanians. Again, like we ended up having to count tweets like this as perspective seeking tweets, but they're not really as sort of, they're not really, they're quite different in flavor, I guess is what I'm trying to say, than the materials we had used in our studies. But nonetheless, we could take these tweets and figure out, okay, so what is, what are the followers going to say in response to these kinds of perspective seeking tweets or perspective avoiding tweets where the senators are saying like, we should just be our side. We shouldn't listen to the other side. And what we find is completely backwards from what we've been finding in our studies. So regardless of whether we look at retweets or likes, regardless of whether we control for a whole bunch of things like the number of followers as a senator has, or it doesn't matter, it happens equally on both parties, regardless of whether we do log transformation on the data, because, as you know, there's some tweets that get a lot more attention than others. We find always the same effect. It's completely backwards from our previous studies. And I think there's a lot that's different between this kind of setup and what we've done before, but I just want to show you first, or like our first question actually on seeing this was like, okay, is this just driven by some weird tweets in our random sample of 5,000, or is this actually something like, is this really a robust difference on Twitter compared to what we've been finding in our studies? And so we went back, it took us a little while to get here. So actually when we went back, it was post 2020. So we actually had a whole new, not that new, but a somewhat new slate of senators with a lot of new tweets in the interim period. So we could get their tweets again. These numbers are off. I should have fixed them. And I don't know why we didn't think of this before, but we hadn't. We realized, oh, maybe instead of just picking a random subsample of these, we should actually look for tweets where people mention the outgroup, right? Where tweets where people are not only talking about listening or ignoring or things like that might be associated with perspective seeking or avoiding, but also tweets where they mention the other side so that they're listening to or ignoring the other side. Maybe we'll have more luck like finding what we're looking for there. So by doing that, we came up with about 1,100 tweets. This was enough, or like few enough that we could just code all of them. And again, first of all, we find the same thing. Like if we try to use like our most strict definition of perspective seeking, we find this is not something that senators are doing on Twitter. But we were able to, because of this new filtering method, we were able to kind of do like a sort of a middle ground where we had to expand our definition a little bit, but still capture tweets that were like kind of close to what we meant by perspective seeking. So for example, you have here Mike Braun talking about how he's quoting from an article talking about how he and this other senator from across the aisle are doing this bipartisan caucus where they're going to have to work together and listen to each other and things like that. And so then we can say, okay, like here's what we had found before. Here's our old results. What are we going to see now? New set of tweets, new like sort of stricter coding criteria. What are we going to see? It turns out we're going to see basically the same thing. So with regard to the difference between seeking and avoiding tweets, it's still there. So there's a difference between the gray bars are a lot higher in this new data set. And I think that's because we picked only tweets that reference the outgroup. So there's a lot of other like nasty things that senators say about each other. And so maybe that's the kind of like, that's what's going on with these gray bars being higher in the new results than the old results. But again, like these results hold for all the same kinds of things. And so we started to believe then, okay, well, there's like obviously something different about this Twitter setup than our previous studies. And maybe you guys are thinking about some kind of obvious differences already. Maybe everyone's been polite enough not to call me out on it, but it seems like a pretty big difference that these are all tweets by US senators, right? Like maybe I don't mind if, my friend Joe, who's also a liberal, goes to talk to a conservative, but the senator is supposed to be like my, battle champion. They're supposed to go to war, not go compromise with the other side. So maybe that's part of what's going on here. Or maybe it's the fact that like these are tweets, and how you talk in a tweet is a little bit different than how you talk, or like what we've kind of presented people with up until now. And so maybe it's like the tweet thing that's a problem. So to look at this, we basically set up a 2x2 design that manipulated both of these features. So we started out with a kind of a story about a regular citizen, similar to what we had used in our previous studies. So for example, if you were pro-gun control, you might read this story about Gary, who's just a citizen from your community. He mentions he supports gun control and he thinks the government should regulate firearms more. But then he makes this point about how he's trying to listen to the other side more and see if we can find common ground in spite of our disagreements. So we take that story and we turn it into a senator, where now it's Senator Gary Peters who's being interviewed on TV and saying all of the same things about how he's going to lately try to talk with other senators about, trying to find common ground. And then we take both of these stories and we turn them into tweets. So like Gary, or Senator Gary, is basically saying the same thing, but saying it in a tweet. And we did this across a bunch of different, or like a few different issues that were all issues that the real senators had actually tweeted about. So we were trying to kind of keep that constant. And we were trying to see, well, okay, is it the case that even though in this condition, people like seekers better than avoiders, maybe, in this condition, we'll find kind of the opposite. So we manipulated this 2x2 thing was manipulated between subjects. Then within subjects, we had people rate a bunch of different things. So we would have them rate a bunch of different stories or a bunch of different tweets, either by senators or like about senators or about citizens. And they're all different about all different issues. And some of them are seeking and some of them are avoiding. And so we can kind of see across all of those comparisons, what happens. So if we look at our first, like our typical sort of paper condition, right, where you're just reading about another person who's got this story going on where they're either seeking or avoiding, we see our typical effect. We like the seeker better. If we look in these other three conditions, we actually see exactly the same thing. This was surprising to me. So actually, like the biggest effect, right, of like our previous replicating our previous finding is the one that's a senator tweeting. So this would suggest that the fact that these are senators and the fact that these are tweets are not really responsible for what's going on, right? Remember, on Twitter, we find this: the purple bar is super high, the orange bar is low. When we try to replicate that by sort of showing senators' tweets to participants, we actually get the complete opposite. And so at this point, we thought, all right, let's go back to our original, like to the stimuli, to like the actual tweets that actual senators wrote. And let's try to think about who is responding to them. So we took these tweets, these like 53 tweets and 118 tweets and a bunch of baseline tweets as well, and we programmed them all into a survey. And we got a sample of participants. I forgot to mention that the last sample was like representative in terms of like the distribution of Democrats and Republicans. We do that again here, even distribution of Democrats and Republicans. And they're rating a whole bunch of tweets, always by senators from their party. And again, our question is, which tweets are they going to give a higher rating to? The tweets that are avoiding or the tweets that are seeking? It turns out, so I'm going to first show you this as a function of people's party affiliation, so ranging from strong Democrats to strong Republicans. And it turns out that there is a huge effect, and it's not linear. It's this quadratic effect. So people who are sort of party moderates, who are not super strongly affiliated with the parties, they actually prefer the tweets that get no love on actual Twitter, right? They like the tweets where the senators are talking about bipartisanship. The extremists on either end, they're the ones who show the flip. And it's these avoiding tweets that really show it, right? For the tweets by seekers, there's just like not really that much going on. The tweets where the senators are just being jerks about the other side and just saying like, I don't want to hear from them. That's something that like moderate people really don't like and extremist people really do like. And we can get the same thing if we look at ideological extremity as opposed to party affiliation, same thing. We have 2 or 3 samples now where we have this. So here's my question for you. Who do you think is out there interacting with tweets by US senators? So we also ask people this question. We say, like, these are all participants who have Twitter accounts, by the way. And we ask them just like, hey, how often do you happen to interact with a tweet by a US senator? Most people say they never do. And this is interesting because this is a mix of moderates and extremists. There are a lot of extremists who aren't doing their thing on Twitter. So this is a mix of moderates and extremists, and they actually have no preference between the two types of tweets. Next, we have about a third of the sample who say this is something they, pretty rarely do. This is also a mix of moderates and extremists. And so overall, there's again, no effect. And then we have this tiny proportion of our sample. And again, we've got this though over 2 or 3 samples. It's always a really small number, but the effect is completely like, there's a huge effect now where they hate those bipartisan tweets and they like, if anything more, these tweets about avoiding opposing perspectives. And so there's like a real minority of people who dislike seekers and who like perspective avoiders, but they're the ones who are active on Twitter. So they're the ones who we're seeing if we go on Twitter and we think that Twitter represents the real world or the way that people think. Well, it's no wonder that I was worried about showing this Megyn Kelly book. If I had shown it on Twitter, I would not have gotten any kind of positive feedback, right? Twitter, and I think this is just really interesting for us to think about, because it's not that Twitter isn't the real world. It is very real, and it is like a very, it contributes to the direction that our world goes in, our country goes in, and so on. But it also, we have to keep in mind that the people who are on Twitter, first of all, not everybody has a Twitter account. Second of all, most people who have Twitter accounts are just lurking and not actually doing anything. So the action that happens on Twitter is, just like, it is a minority of people. Anyway, so why do people underestimate how much we like perspective seekers? Maybe it's Twitter's fault. I don't think we have direct data for this, but it's sort of my ongoing intuition. Okay, and just to kind of wrap things up, I said before that people are a bit less polarized than their leaders, and that's true, but it's also like a trend that's decreasing over time. So this is, as presumably we'll get another one of these in 2024, right, where the overlap will be even smaller. And I'm seeing Stanley has a question about this. We didn't get them to explain why people did and didn't interact with senators' tweets. So I would say that these are, like, most of the senators' tweets are not viral. Like, I'm sure the senators love a viral tweet when they can get one, but it doesn't happen very often. So I'm not sure that it has anything to do with like virality specifically, but I do imagine that there is something about the Twitter algorithm, which I feel like it used to just show you all of the tweets in order, but I know it doesn't do that anymore. So maybe there's something about that where, it gets reinforced. I mean, I'm sure there's something about that where it gets reinforced. So if you're interacting a lot with it once, then you're going to get it again. Whereas if that's never something that you do, then, you have a low chance of seeing it if your senator tweets, even if you follow them. But yeah, I'm not sure enough about the dynamics of Twitter to give a better answer to that question, Stanley, sorry. But just to kind of return to this point, right? Like, maybe it sort of feels like we're running out of time a little bit, while we still have this possibility where seeking each other's perspectives is actually going to yield something positive. And so people I'm really grateful for people like this guy who's sort of open to talking to the other side. I'm really grateful for people like Sarah Silverman, who had this show that got discontinued, which is kind of interesting in the context of this work, but this show about like talking to basically where she as a liberal would go out and talk to Americans. And maybe that's kind of, we need more of that to sort of overcome the harsh realities that Twitter is kind of telling us about. So I know we're almost out of time, and I see that Julia has a question, so I'm going to stop and let the question come.
Cool, this is so interesting. I'm curious about like what characterizes the people who are super active on Twitter, because I feel like before Twitter existed, those people still existed in our lives, right? Like, are they sort of the activists? Are they people who are like not just politically extreme, but are, for whom political engagement is really high? It makes me think about like people people buy a book, right? And there's a version of this where like, well, if I don't have a Twitter account, then nobody can punish me for it because I'm not on Twitter. But obviously that's not true, because there's some other people in your life who are like these Twitter-like people.
This is super interesting, and it's something I've just started to think about recently, because I was sort of focused on these like, psychological variables like ideological extremity and things like that. And then realizing like, oh, yes, ideological extremity is correlated with Twitter use, but there are way more extreme people than there are Twitter. There are way more people who have extreme views or who would report themselves as a 7 or a 1 on an ideology scale than there are people who are active on Twitter. And so I don't know yet what characterizes those people, but I think it's I was talking earlier with this a little bit with Julian, like, we have to take that into account in our research. If we want to, if ever our research goals are to affect things that are happening on Twitter, we can't just do that by studying the general population. We have to study the people who are actually active on Twitter to find out what interventions are going to affect them, what actually drives them to do what they do, because, we know that they're a bit unique by virtue of the fact that there aren't that many people who are super active on Twitter. And so I think, we have to just be careful with what we do and don't know about them. Louisa, I see your hand is up too.
Yeah, thank you so much. Such an interesting set of findings, and the talk was amazing. I was wondering that I feel like one big difference between the Twitter findings and your studies is that the Twitter also has a large audience. So I was wondering if that could play a role. I know that one of your studies, you said that it was a group and there were Confederates, but it seemed that people's option to collaborate with that one person was still made in private. While here you're kind of, on Twitter, everything you do is kind of documented. It's a lot of, people say like virtue signaling, right? Like there's a lot of like showcasing your groupiness. Because of the fact that there's a large audience watching. So I was just wondering if you thought that your studies would change at all if people were aware that they were surrounded by in-group members, for example.
Yeah, so it's really interesting because, most people like seekers, then you would think that making it public would exaggerate that pattern, right? Like the pattern where people are going to be seeking more. So I think that the misunderstanding, the misperception is really key to kind of understanding that like, why would it make sense that when something is public, people do more of the thing that most people hate? So I think that's interesting. But then to kind of your more specific question about what would happen in our studies if we made them public, that is something we're kind of working on a little bit now with the follow-up to some of these misperception studies, is trying to see whether, the extent to which the misperceptions guide people's private versus public behavior, and whether if we intervene on the misperceptions and try to correct them, can we change, that should change public behavior, but maybe it'll also change private behavior. We're not really sure. So this is super interesting, and we don't have a good answer yet.
So Kristin, we often get questions, especially at HKS, about leadership behavior, right? So we have a bunch of public leaders in training over here, and on one hand, the talk started out with, yes, go be open-minded and listen to opposing views, and finished with, no, don't do that. Any advice on what we should tell people who are thinking about careers that are sort of in public service or that are elected, that want to be sensible, reasonable human beings, but know they will be tweeted about?
Yeah, this is a great question, and you're definitely asking the wrong person. I feel like perpetually unable to understand like how those kinds of things work. Yeah, I don't think I have a satisfactory answer to this question. I could say that, I could sort of punt and say I have a whole other paper that says that if you're a public figure, you should, if you think there's ever a chance you're going to change your mind about something, you should make a pragmatic case as opposed to a moral case, because it's easier to walk back a pragmatic case and change your mind than it is to walk back a moral case and change your mind. Although that's just like one paper among many that look at this question of, framing things in moral and pragmatic terms. But in terms of being open-minded, I mean, I guess I don't see like a way that democracy survives if we can't be open-minded. And so regardless of like how it's going to affect your career or your likability, I feel like there sort of is no choice but to try to understand each other across the aisle and try to get to places of mutual understanding. So that's going to be my advice, even though I'm not sure it's good advice for your career necessarily.
All right. Well, that seems like a very Kennedy School note to leave things on.
Okay.
Do things that are good for democracy.
Please fix democracy, you guys. Please. I have a whole other talk I could have given about democracy, but it would have been like more depressing than this one. So I'm counting on you.
Thank you so much. This was terrific. The talk will be posted on the website. Kevin, there's a question in the chat about the link, so maybe you can pop that in the chat real quick so folks can find the talk. Thank you again, Kristin, and we will see everybody back next month for Gordon Pennycook.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me. It was truly super fun. And I hope to see you all soon somehow.
Bye, everyone.
New Orleans, hello, you're welcome.